Yes, so in the last class, we would have discussed advanced filter. We were talking about how can we filter our data, how can we search for data. So we said that there are two types of filters. There is the auto filter, the simple filter, and there is the advanced filter. And basically, you have to remember for the advanced filter, there are three things you need. Basically, the original table, the original data. Basically, what do you want to filter? The criteria that you're going to filter. The question basically you're going to ask the data. And where are you going to filter this data? So those three things: the data, the criteria, and the location of the output. Does anyone remember the two types of criteria?
And criteria and or criteria.
Very good. But what is the difference between the and the or?
The
Sir,
and
the and
criteria answers all questions at the same time, whereas all criteria answers all questions one after each other.
All right. Anyone else? Anything to add? The rest of you agree? Or you disagree? Anybody disagree? Not hearing anything? Agree? All right. So, as mentioned, the and criteria answers both of the criteria at the same time. So it has to be less than, it has to be more than at the same time. Whereas the or criteria, it's basically one after each other. You answer the first question, you answer the first criteria, then you go on to the next one. All right, somebody other than Emmanuel, how do you tell the difference between an and an or criteria? How do you tell the difference?
Sir, in the and criteria, all the data is in one row, and in the or criteria, it's in different rows.
Could you go back over, Robert, for me one more time? I didn't hear it.
Sir, in the and criteria, all the criteria is in one row, and in the or criteria, it's in different rows.
Very good. That is correct. So that's how you can visually tell the difference between the two criteria. And has the criteria in the same row, whereas the or has it in different rows. So it doesn't matter what order you put it in. Like for example, this one here, it doesn't matter if the less than 11 is at the top, it doesn't matter if it's at the bottom. Take the projector. Hey. Yes, so the OR criteria, it uses, it has the criteria in different rows. Morning. So as I was saying, the AND criteria has the criteria in the same row, and the OR has it in different rows. So good. So that's how you tell the difference visually. So today we're moving on to is pivot tables. We're going to try to finish off this chapter today so that you guys can do these questions at homework. Even if we don't finish it off, do these questions as homework for next week's class, next week Tuesday, and start practicing your exercises with yourself or with your partner, however you want to do it. Later on, I'm going to combine exercises together to create one assignment, another assignment. So that will be another coursework. So Good. So what we're looking at today is pivot tables. We're going to look at what is a pivot table, because when you go into spreadsheets, you're basically seeing so much noise. You're basically seeing a bunch of rows and columns, and just highlighting a row and column, you're going to get what appears to be tables. So this is a table, but what is a pivot table now? Why would you need a pivot table? What is a pivot table? That's what we'll be looking at. So, let's see. Jasmine Primo, are you there?
Yes, sir.
All right, can you read for us pivot table?
Pivot tables. As your data increases, it can become more time consuming to update ranges of tables, functions, and columns. Depending on how you need to display your results, a pivot table makes it easier to summarize your data without altering the original location of your data. Even if more data is added to your spreadsheet, the pivot table can be quickly updated. Pivot charts can also be created from a pivot table. To create a pivot table from a set of data in a worksheet, you should check that your data is arranged as follows. You should have at least three columns.
Pause there. Thank you. We'll look at this first information first and then go on to that. Thank you. All right, so when you're putting in your data into your spreadsheet, it's going to be taking up these rows and columns, these cells, and so on. It's going to be taking up all of these spaces here. So remember, chapter is basically focusing on how can we search for data? How can we search specific information that we may want to find? So the pivot table is used to summarize your data without altering that original data. So we can compare it to something like the advanced filter. The advanced filter, or let me go back to the simple filter. When we were using the simple filter, when we filtered, it basically changed the data in that location. So whatever you filtered, data in that location was hidden once it didn't pass the criteria. So for example, let me look at donation doesn't exist. So what I'm talking about is that when you put on the simple filter, you click on filter and you sort the information. Say for example, you only want to see 250. What you're basically doing here, you are altering the original data. Because if you notice, you don't see the rest of the original data. So in this situation, if you wanted to compare it now, compare the two. If you want to compare this output with the original, you can't. You cannot. Because the original location was changed. So this situation you cannot. So that is why we have the advanced filter, whereby you can output the data to another location, and when it is output to another location, you can compare the two. You can compare the original and you can compare the output data. Can you guys hear me clearly, or the rain affecting us?
No, sir, I can hear you clearly.
Alright. Is that for everyone?
Yes, sir.
Alright.
Yes, sir.
Good. So what we're talking about is that when you're summarizing this data or outputting this data, you can see both the original data and what you are outputting. The pivot table is similar to that advanced filter. You can still have the original data, but you're going to use the pivot table to summarize the data basically into another location. So give me a second. Um, the blades. Are good. See, you want to use it. Are good. If you guys hear me disconnect, let me know because somebody's here checking out the Wi-Fi, checking out the internet. Good. So we're, we're gonna look at now what do we need to do to create a pivot table. What are some of the rules? There are some of the requirements we need to create this pivot table here. Jasmine, Roberton, are you there? Jasmine, Roberton. I think you read last week. Jonathan, are you there?
Yes, sir.
Alright, can you read for us, Jonathan, to create?
Okay, sir. To create a pivot table from a set of data in a worksheet, you have you should check that your data is arranged as follows. You should have at least 3 columns of data. Each column of data should have its unique field heading. Your data should be organized in a tabular format and not have a blank row between the column headings and the first row of data. Check that the data set also does not have blank rows or columns. Review the data to ensure that it has been entered accurately. Mixing up data causes incorrect results.
Alright, great. I thought Georgetown was supposed to be a silent area. Anyway, so these are the requirements basically you must have in order to create a pivot table. So basically, when you're creating a pivot table, when you're creating a pivot table, firstly, you're going to have a table with data. Like for example, this here. You have a table here with data. You have the rank column, the language column, the speaker column. So you have a table, it's storing data. So that is what you're going to have in the first place. Now, with this table now, you're going to create a pivot table to summarize some of the information. Like for example, maybe you want to see languages that end with I. So for example, those two. So you could put that in the pivot table. Or a more practical example, sometimes you might say you want to see languages that are less than maybe 200. So for example, these two languages at the bottom. Languages that have less than 200 speakers. So you summarize that information and you put it in the pivot table. So you first have a table with data. That's the first requirement. Now, that table with data must have at least 3 columns of data. So if you notice this table that we just looked at, this one here has 4 columns of data. So you must have at least 3 columns of data. Now, each column, the second requirement, each column must have a heading, a unique heading. So what do we mean by that? headings for the table. These headings at the top here, each column must have a heading. The rank heading, the language heading, the speaker's heading, so that we know what data is in that column, basically. Three. Point number three. Your data must be tabular, basically coming down vertically. Yes, vertically, top to bottom. So you're gonna put your data in that manner. So the headings coming across at the top, like you see it here, and the data falling under it. That is called tabular. In addition to that, there must be no blank row because that can affect the creation of the pivot table. There basically must not be any blank row or any blank cell when you're highlighting the table or using the table. And 4, it says not to have any blank rows or column. And then the last requirement is the most basic requirement. Ensure your data is accurate. Because in the first place, we are pulling data from this table here. We are pulling data from this table that you're seeing here. We're using the data from this table. So obviously, if you're going to summarize this table and the data is wrong, then the summary is going to be wrong also. So you have to ensure that the data in the first place is accurate, everything is correct, so that when you summarize, it will give you the correct summary. Good. So what we're going to look at now is how to create that pivot table. So first we need a table. So I'm going to turn off this filter. So we're going to use this as our table once again. I'm going to highlight it so that we can see it clearly. Are you guys hearing me clearly?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Alright. So we're going to use this table here to create our pivot table. So as I mentioned in the last class, when you are selecting a table, you can highlight it. When you're going to use a feature that uses a table, you can highlight it, or you can simply click on one single cell anywhere inside the table, because spreadsheet will automatically detect that table. So I'm going to click on medical supplies, and then I'm going to go to the insert tab. So pivot tables on the insert, and look, it's right here on the very left, right next to tables. So this is the table section. We have pivot table. So when I click on this here, the create pivot table box will appear. Now it's basically only two options you have to focus on. The first option at the top here is what is the data that you want to summarize. What is the range? What is the table? So if you notice, if you guys can see, the marching ants going around the table once again, because I selected a cell inside the table. So it automatically detected that table and selected that table for me. Otherwise, if it did not, notice the margin ants disappeared. Otherwise, I would have to click on this arrow here and then highlight all of the data like this here. I notice the margin ants went around it, around the table once again. I click back on the arrow, and that is how you would highlight your data, your table that you want to be in your pivot table. Are you guys following so far?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Great. So the second point now for creating the pivot table is, where do you want to put the pivot table? Do you want to put it in the same sheet, existing sheet, and you see the location? Or do you want to put it into a new worksheet? So if I say existing sheet, I would have to click on this arrow once again, scroll to empty location, for example at the bottom here, just select one cell to indicate the starting point. You could highlight, but it makes more sense to just highlight that starting point. So just select one single cell to be your starting point, and you basically click OK, and you have created a pivot table here. Just that it has no data inside of it as yet. Now, I'm not going to use this one. I'm going to create it in another sheet so that we can see it clearly. So once again, to create a pivot table, select any cell in the table, go to Insert, click on Pivot Table. The table was already highlighted for us. We're going to leave it on New Worksheet, and we're going to select OK. So notice we're in a new sheet. Pivot table is on the left hand side here. And on the right hand side, notice a box appeared. Some options here appeared. This is very important in creating your pivot table. This is actually how you create your pivot table. So if you notice at the bottom here, you have columns, you have rows, and you have values. So at the bottom here, you have columns, rows, values, and filters. So basically, you click on a field or a column heading from this box at the top here. You click on a field or a box from the top here, and you simply drag it into one of these boxes at the bottom. If you drag it into the column, notice it appeared in the columns. I just created a pivot table with headings in the columns here. If I drag this into the rows, notice all the information shifted over into the rows. I drag it back over to the column, it's now in the columns. I drag it back over to the rows, it's now in the rows. So basically, you're using this pivot table field box to create your pivot table. And it's just simply drag it and drop in. You could check it, and what it's going to do is automatically going to select the most appropriate location. So if I selected item, notice it automatically put it into the rows. If I select receive, notice it automatically put it inside of values. It didn't put it inside of the rows because that will happen. So they put it inside of the values to represent that this is a value of what is inside of the rows. If you put it inside a column, that is how it's going to appear. It is inside of the columns for this pivot table. So whenever you're creating a pivot table, you simply move around the fields to ensure that you get the most suitable layout of your table. So what you would try to do is put a field inside of the column or a field inside of the row, and then you would put another field inside of the values, and that way information is going to fall under the column or it's going to go into the row. Now, let me see. Good, so it's that simple to create a pivot table. Are you guys following? Any questions? No questions? Alright. So, when it comes to the pivot tables, there are two types of pivot tables, or two kinds. There is the one-dimensional pivot table, and then there is the two-dimensional pivot table. So it says here, by default, Excel summarizes your data by either summing or counting. This is important to remember here. Excel summarizes, because remember the pivot table is used to summarize your data. So Excel summarizes by counting or summing. What do we mean by that? Well, if we go back to our pivot table and we drag items to the rows, and we're going to drag receive into the values. If you notice here, it says sum of receive. If we drag it to the columns, notice it's just receive. It doesn't have sum. If I drag shipping dates, notice it says count of shipping dates. So what it's basically doing, whatever data you put inside of these values, it is summarizing the values. It's using a method to summarize it. So in this example here, sum means to add. So what it's basically doing, it is adding the values that is in the shipping table. So this shipped data here, it is adding these values. So you might be wondering, how does it add a single value? Or hopefully you're wondering that, how is it adding as a value to itself? Well, think of it if a name was repeating. For example, I'm going to rename all of this as water. And for future reference, if you notice the pivot table did not update, so you simply right click on the pivot table and there's a refresh option here. So refresh, and if you notice what has happened here, I only have water. And if you notice, it added up all of the shipped that was under water. It added up everything, so it summed up everything. So that is how it was summarizing. It was grouping all of the items that was falling under. Basically, if water, like how you see water appearing multiple times, it grouped it into one and summarized the data by adding. Now what if we don't want to summarize by adding? Well, you can click on the arrow here. You can go to the value field settings and you can change it. You can say count. So you can count how many waters are there. So there were 7 waters. So I'm summarizing it in that way. I want to know how many waters is inside of my table. We can also get the average. So 4-5 is the average. We can also get the maximum. 8,000 is the maximum. So that is how you summarize the data. And if you notice, you're not putting a lot of information into this table. You're not creating a large table. It's up to you if you want to see that information. But it's basically to put in the simple information that you need to summarize it. So you would simply put information either in the row or the column and some sort of value information, some sort of value data inside of the values and say how do you want to summarize this data. Are you guys following?
Yes, sir.
Alright, so that is how you summarize your data using the pivot table. Now, it continues. If so, numeric values are usually dragged to the values area. Remember that? Numeric values are usually dragged to the values area. Because if you look at the summarize option, count, average, max, min, sum, you cannot do those with numbers, with letters. You cannot do those with words. So you need values, you need numbers in order to summarize. So you would mostly try to put numbers into this value area here. But that doesn't mean you cannot put other types of data. For example, I can put text data. For example, item. Item only had text inside of it. It only has water inside of it. But if we check the field options here, if I click sum, it's not going to do anything. If I click on max, it's not going to do anything also, it's still zero because it can't do any calculations on letters. The only thing it can do is basically count how many waters, count how many texts that are basically similar. So when you want to summarize the data, to add up the data, to get the maximum value, get the minimum value, you're going to use that sum, you're going to put values into that values area. But say for instance you want to count how many words are appearing, you can put it inside there and use the count summary option there. But it's mostly numbers or values you would put into that values area. And the text would go into the rows or column. Now, we are talking about this one-dimensional pivot table. When you're creating this one-dimensional table, what do they mean? It basically means that you drag a field either to the row or to the column. So a field is going to be either in the row or the column. And that there is a one-dimensional pivot table. So let's look at the example. So what you're seeing right now, exactly what you're seeing right now, is a one-dimensional pivot table. I have one field inside of the columns box, and I have one field inside of the values. That there is one-dimensional. If I drag this field over into the rows, I still have a one-dimensional pivot table because only one field is in either the row or the column. If I put fields into both, then what I have there is a two-dimensional pivot table. So once data is in the row and the column at the same time, it is a two-dimensional pivot table. Once it is only in one of the row or column, it is in one-dimensional pivot table. Doesn't matter which one. It could be in the row, it could be in the column. Doesn't matter. It's going to be a one-dimensional pivot table. Are you guys following on that?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Now, it says, suppose you wish to find out how many students in each subject receive results. I think it's basically trying to create a pivot table. Yeah, I was basically trying to do that. Good. So as I mentioned, the two-dimensional pivot table, it shows a column or row of data. So if you have a field in the row and a field in the column, you are going to have a two-dimensional pivot table. So as I mentioned, this here is a two-dimensional pivot table. Information in the rows and columns. So as you see in the image here, information in the columns and information in the rows. That is a two-dimensional pivot table. But this one here, it only has information in the rows. This is just the values here at the top. This is not information in the column. That's just the value being counted. So this here is a one-dimensional pivot table because nothing is inside of the columns box. Great. So that is how you create a pivot table. That is how you create a one-dimensional pivot table. And that is how you create a two-dimensional pivot table. Alright, so next we're going to look at frequency distribution. Karishma, are you there?
Yes, sir.
Alright, can you read for us?
Frequency distribution. Sometimes you may want to count the number of times a value occurs in a set of data or how many times a specific payment was made between two dates. Creating a frequency distribution provides this information quickly for you. For example, suppose you have a list of students with their ages, and you wish to find out how many students grouped in 2 year intervals registered for exams. Figure 7.50 shows the initial pivot table that is created after you drag the age field to both the rows area and the values area. Grouping the ages in intervals of 2 produces the frequency distribution for those in the two age ranges who registered for the subjects.
Great. Now, can anybody tell me what is the frequency? Does anybody know? In maths. What is frequency in maths? Or y'all didn't do that in maths?
Sir, it's the number of times the data value occurs.
Good. The number of times it occurs. Good. So that can be one example. And so basically in our example, what we're looking at is that when you group data together, you can look at it from that perspective. So for example, when you're looking at students' age, for example, you might want to say this certain age group, maybe ages 11 and 12, what grades did they get? Instead of looking at it individually, you can look at it together. Or you can say ages 13 and 14. So how do we create this pivot, this frequency distribution? Well, firstly, we need numbers to do this frequency distribution. So we're going to do students, we're going to do age, and we're going to do grades. So remember, it's numbers that we need to do this frequency distribution. So 13, 12, 13, 14, 15, 13, 16, 14, 13. So those are the ages that we have there. Grades, that's going to make up some random grades. Good. Now, firstly, I think it's a pivot table we need to create. Yes. So we need to, let's see. Give me a second. Instead of item, I'm going to put receive. I'm going to put the item here. Is that about yeah, well done. Correct. Good. Good. So to create a frequency distribution, it's basically you want to group specific data together in a certain frequency. Like for example, you want to see it in groups of threes, groups of fours, groups of fives, or maybe, for example, age. You want to see students between the age of 10 and 15, students between the age of 16 and 20, those are frequencies. So if you notice what I just did, I placed a value inside of the row. This received here is a value. I placed it inside of the row. And what I did, I placed item inside of the values. So what I'm basically doing, I'm counting how how much items got this specific value. For example, how many items got 3250? 1. How many items got 3500? 1, and so on. Now that's not the important part. The important part is that I needed to put a field with values inside of this row. So this column here need to be values. So that when I right click on it, I'm going to see this group option here. Notice this group option here. If I do not put values, so say I take out this receive and I put item, that is text. If I right click on it, I cannot group. Cannot group that selection. Why? Because it is not numbers. We cannot group numbers once again. So just like how you could not have summarize the letters with sum, max, min, and so on, we cannot group the letters. We can only group numbers. So firstly, you have to put the numbers inside of the rows field. You can put it inside the column, no problem also. I think it should be able to work. Yeah. But it's more presentable inside of the rows. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a frequency distribution. So as mentioned, values need to be in the rows. And what you're going to do, you're going to right click and you're going to select group. Now this box is going to appear. And what this box is basically asking of us is to create a frequency. So how much do we want it to be grouped by? Every 2000. If you notice, I just press enter and that was basically it. It was grouped by every 2000. If I group it by 3000, notice it further reduced. 3000 to 6000, 6 to 9, 9 to 12. So it's in a frequency of 3000. One group is going to take it off. So once again, how do we create a frequency distribution? You right click on the number values, you click on group, and you basically indicate how do you want to group it. Do you want to group it by 500? It's grouped by every 500 there. Now remember the values, it still has to be it still has to stick to the values that was input, so that's why it might not look exactly like 500 difference and 1000 difference and so on, but it's within that frequency range. So basically what's happening here, 2 got in that range. We have 2 values in this range here. We have 2 values in this range here, 1 in this range, and so on. So for example, a more practical example would have been this age here. So if I create a pivot table from it, new sheet. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to drag age into rows, and then I'm going to drag age into values, and I'm going to count it so we can see how many of the ages we have. So we have 1 12-year-old, 4 13-year-olds, 2 14-year-olds, and so on. So once again, to create a frequency distribution, you right click on the value, click on group, this box will appear, and you basically say how much do you want to group it by. So if you notice, there's a start and ending value. So if I did not want to include 16, I can put in 15. So that way it's going to exclude that 16-year-old, those 2, but we're going to put it in. So if I want to group it by every 2 years, I can put 2. And notice my frequency distribution here. I have 5 students within the age range of 12 and 13, and 5 of them within the age range of 14 to 16 there. And that's basically it, how you create your frequency distribution. It's basically grouping the data into a frequency, into a certain range, so that you can see the information from that perspective. Are you guys following?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
All right, so it's 10 o'clock. Um, it's only two more information. Let's wrap up the chapter and then we're gonna close off. So the remaining content is basically creating a pivot chart and modifying the pivot chart. So how do we create this pivot chart now? Well, from the pivot table, we create a pivot chart. Where is my, oh, I gotta recreate it. So I'm gonna create a pivot table, items there, received in values. So I have a pivot table here. I'm going to use sum instead of count. Okay. I have a pivot table here. Now from this pivot table, you could right click on it and not seeing the option here. Alright, so I guess we gotta go to the top. Pivot table design, pivot table analyze. Notice the option here, pivot chart. Somebody's now joining. Notice the option at the top here, pivot chart. So when we click on that now, this box is going to appear for us to insert a chart. So we simply click on whatever chart we want. If you want a column chart, we click on that and we've just created a chart from our pivot table. It's that simple. So once again, you click inside of your pivot table because if you notice at the top here, we no longer have pivot table analyze. So click inside of the pivot table. You're going to see the option at the top here, pivot table, some option for pivot table. You're going to see it at the top. Or even if you don't, you can go to insert and you're going to see pivot chart here also. So you can click on pivot chart and click on OK. Basically select the chart if you want, click OK, and you've just created your pivot chart. Now, we're going to talk more about this pivot chart later on, but we're looking at that chapter about charts. So the last thing is basically how do we move the chart? Well, basically you right click on it, and there's the move chart option here. And you basically say where do you want to move it. You can move it to another sheet or you can move it to a new sheet. Either one. So notice I just moved it to a new sheet here. So once again, to create your pivot chart, you click anywhere in the pivot table, click on pivot table analyze, click on pivot chart, select your chart and click OK. Or you can go to insert and you're going to see the pivot chart option here. And then once again, how do you move it? You simply right click on any blank area. You cannot right click any data because this is what's going to happen. You have to right click on a blank area and then you're going to see the move chart option. So that is for moving the pivot table, moving the pivot chart. Okay, moving the pivot table. Now, how do you delete that pivot table now? How do you delete that pivot table? Well, simply you highlight it and you press the delete key. That's how you delete the pivot table. You basically highlight all the information and you press the delete key. Or you can press, well, backspace is not going to work. So you gotta press the delete key and that will delete the data. That will delete the pivot table. And I just showed you guys how to update it, how to update the pivot table. I told you that if you make a change in the table, if you make a change in this table here, it does not automatically update in your pivot table. So that's important to remember. When you make a change in your main table, it does not automatically update in the pivot table. So you'll have to right click on it and click refresh so that it gets that updated.
Sorry, you're breaking up.
Alright, which part? Did you hear me talk about moving the table, moving the pivot table? Alright, can you guys hear me?
Hearing you now, sir.
Alright, well, before the Wi-Fi gets even worse, we're going to close off here for today. We're going to continue with all of that next week. So what you guys going to do, you're going to complete the questions for homework for next week's class. So we're going to review back the pivot chart, the pivot table, moving, and so on. And you guys are going to practice your exercise.
You're gone again, sir.
Can you hear me now?
Now hearing you, sir.
Alright,
Yes, sir. I'm hearing you.
I'm basically saying complete the questions for your homework and do the exercises, practice your exercises for the next class. That is all. So we're going to close off here for today.
Okay, sir.
So see you guys next week.
See you, sir. You have a good day.